good idea. I mean, I agree. I mean, yeah, that's one good thing that happened since Trump got up there.
Hi, everyone. This is Sarah Butler with FaithTrust Institute, and we're delighted that you're joining us here today. So we're going to be talking about how faith communities talk about abstinence and virginity and how that impacts teens. We're delighted to have Reverend Lydia Mulkey here with us. And I also want to take a moment to thank our sponsor for this conversation, which is the In Faith Community Foundation. Oops, a little too far. So I also want to apologize for any technical glitches. They are all on my end. And please bear with us. It's a new platform that we're trying out. So Lydia, I'm going to hand it over to you, and let's start the presentation.
Great. Well, I'm so glad that you are joining us for this conversation about abstinence and virginity. We're going to talk about some tough things today because we're talking about how our teachings about abstinence and virginity affect survivors of sexual violence. So I encourage you to take care of yourself. If you need to take a break or tune out for a little bit or call a friend after this, I encourage you to do so. This is a really important conversation that we're going to have. Whether your faith community teaches sexuality education explicitly or only implicitly, and whether you teach abstinence only education or a comprehensive program, it matters how we talk about abstinence and virginity. Whatever we teach, we know that we have our explicit curriculum, the things that we say, the things that we intend for our students to take home. And then we have our implicit curriculum, the things that we don't actually say aloud or we don't actually mean for the students to take home, but are natural byproducts of the way that we're teaching. So it's really important that we become aware and pay attention to those implicit messages. Too often, those are the ones that stick. So when we teach abstinence, what are we really teaching? I'm going to give you the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is health and safety. This is probably your explicit curriculum in your faith community. I am sure that you want teens to stay healthy and you want teens to stay safe. And that is why you are giving whatever messages you're giving about abstinence and virginity. You have the very best of intentions. I know that, or you wouldn't be tuning in for this. But often we get other implicit messages mixed up in our hopes for health and safety. So here's the bad. The bad message is sexuality is bad and icky, and we'd rather not deal with it, and we'd rather you not do it. We don't mean to teach this, but many of us, I bet, can think back to our own sexuality education and hear that message pretty clearly, often expressed by students after a sexual education program as, if you have sex, you will get a disease and die, but sex is beautiful and you should save it for someone you really love. A lot of us got that message. And if we're lucky, that's as bad as it gets. But there is something even worse. There is the ugly. Our ugly implicit curriculum is the reinforcement of cultural beliefs that create the conditions for sexual violence. This is an ugly truth of some forms of abstinence education, and we're going to unpack those more as we go on today. It's not intentional on our parts. we have the best of intentions, as I said, but we slip sometimes into messages that we just aren't aware of. So today is really about raising our awareness so that we can really understand what we're really teaching and what students are hearing in our faith communities. So knowing that you are a good person who wants health and safety for your students, how do we talk about abstinence so that all we get is that good stuff, that health and safety? And I think to start thinking about that, the first thing we need to do is listen to what victim survivors of sexual violence are telling us about the way that we're teaching abstinence. We have an example who has been all over the news and other media in Elizabeth Smart. Elizabeth was abducted at the age of 14 and was held captive for 9 months. And she's talked about how her religious beliefs sustained her during that ordeal, but also how the information she received in her faith community about sex harmed her. After being sexually abused by her kidnapper, she remembered being taught that having sex is like chewing a piece of gum, that you can't unchew it. She said that feeling filthy and dirty like a chewed piece of gum, as she was taught in her abstinence education, made her sometimes feel that there was no use in getting free anyway. She says, I thought, oh my gosh, I'm that chewed up piece of gum. Nobody re-chews a piece of gum, you throw it away. And that's how easy it is to feel like you no longer have worth, you no longer have value. Smart said, why would it even be worth screaming out? Why would it even make a difference if you're rescued? Your life still has no value. The Sexuality Information Council of the United States put out a statement in one of their campaigns that speaks very clearly to what these messages do for victim survivors. The message that those who have not remained abstinent or are dirty or less than or are that chewed gum or any of the other many metaphors that get used, this statement says that those serve to inflict greater harm upon those who have survived coerced sexual behavior. Such messages are likely to cause further feelings of hurt, shame, anger, and embarrassment in these already victimized young people. When we're teaching about sexuality in our congregations, often the last group that gets thought of is these victim survivors, when really they need to be the first that we think about. We need to design our curriculum from a place of recognizing their needs first. We need to think about what our curriculum sounds like to them before we think about what it sounds like to anyone else. So now that we've thought about the potential effects of our curriculum on victim survivors of sexual violence, let's look at the efficacy of what we've been teaching toward health and safety, that good outcome that we were looking for. So what does research tell us about the way we've taught abstinence and virginity? I'm giving you some information that comes from a great book that's going to be in your resources called Sex and Faith, Talking to Your Child from Birth to Adolescence. And for parents out there, this is a great resource. But within this book, we get some information about abstinence and virginity teachings. So virginity pledges delay the average age of first intercourse by only 18 months. And those who broke pledges were a third less likely to use contraception or STI protection than teens who had not taken a virginity pledge. So that sounds like less health and safety rather than more. Teens learned that abstinence meant avoiding penis-vagina intercourse, a very specific sexual act, and tended to engage in other risky sexual behaviors without understanding the risk. the other thing to note is that trends in premarital sex have seen no great change, even though trends in abstinence have seen great change. We had quite a movement toward teaching abstinence in our culture, and the way that we've done that hasn't really affected in the way that we were hoping. So if that isn't working, if it's having a harmful effect on survivors of sexual violence, then we need to think about new ways to do this, and we need to know what works. So research shows that teens actually do delay sexual intercourse when they have a supportive environment, open communication with parents and influential adults, positive self-identity, self-esteem, and pro-social activities like church and sports and hobbies, and when they have a sense that they have a future, that there's something out there for them after high school. So I want us to focus on that open communication with parents and other adults. How do we accomplish that? How do we talk about abstinence and virginity in ways that maintain open communication and also don't do additional harm? So in order to talk about that, maybe we need to work on our definition of abstinence. So let's think about that. First, do we need a definition of abstinence? There are a few reasons that I think we do. The first one is the cultural weight of the terms abstinence and virginity. Our teens know these terms and they have their own definitions for them. So this is a huge factor because of who teens are and where they are in their development. So as we think about this, think about two things about the teenage stage of development. First of all, they are more interested in romantic and sexual relationships. They're at a phase where they're really thinking about that. Second, they are at that stage of development where they're seeking independence from their parents. And the way that they are doing that is by forming a family out of their friends to practice making a family. This is what teens do. They practice making families with their friends. And so the social influence of their friends is huge. So we have to be able to engage what they're hearing from their peer groups and from their culture, from teen culture, about sexuality. So I would say that engaging definitions of abstinence and virginity and kind of the cultural norms for those definitions is crucial. We need to be able to speak about and within the messages that they're getting from their peers and from the media. What teens believe about these terms has a huge effect on their emotional and spiritual health as well. We've already seen this really clearly in the example of Elizabeth Smart. And as we've thought about our language around abstinence and virginity and how it affects survivors. But this affects all teens. It affects their spiritual health in very important ways. We also need to remember that the terms abstinence and virginity are happen within a culture, that there's some misogyny and some violence attached to them, and we're going to unpack that more later when we talk about purity culture. But there's a lot that we need to hold when we start thinking about a definition for abstinence. We have to unpack them, but we have to be ready with an alternative to the traditional uses of these words that have been harmful. So we need a new definition. and we need a way to get there. So let's start by looking at how the old definitions came to be. If we define abstinence and virginity, on what are we basing these definitions? Well, one of the traditional ways to define this has been based on physical risk. A definition of abstinence based on physical risk says that you remain abstinent until you engage in a behavior that that seriously threatens your physical safety if done in an unsafe way. The pros here of this definition, if health and safety is our top priority, then this definition certainly prioritizes health. This says if it's not a health or safety risk, then it is okay. If you can do it, essentially the definition is if this doesn't involve exchange of fluids, then you are still abstinent. Now, the cons of this is that it's actually a very clinical definition of abstinence. Show no emotion, feel no pain. It's a definition that we need some of. We need some of that, but it can get out of balance because there is a spiritual and emotional aspect to our sexuality. There are also sexualities for whom this definition might not work. For example, there are people within the LGBTQ community that may find great intimacy without great physical risk. And this definition doesn't really engage the realities of some people's sexuality. Also, how do we talk about sexual violence within this framework? It's possible, we can talk about it, but we have to take into account that if all we teach is that this is a choice and we don't acknowledge that that choice can be taken away by violence, then we have left something very important out. If we celebrate someone choosing to stay abstinent by not practicing any sexual activities that involve physical risk, but we don't explicitly name that it's possible to be put at risk against one's will, this could be just as harmful as any other way to define abstinence. So that was the first way that is a traditional way to define abstinence based on risk. This is typically present in comprehensive sexuality education programs, but there's another common definition, which is based on intimacy. The intimacy definition is typical in abstinence-only education. The pros there, it honors the fact that there is an emotional and spiritual element to our human sexuality, which is a very important thing. It also, usually without meaning to, honors sexualities that may not fit within the risk-based definition. And then you can decide if this is a pro or a con, but this definition is very open to interpretation. And if you look from curriculum to curriculum, from faith tradition to faith tradition, you'll find that where the line is on this kind of abstinence is really a moving target. Some curriculum may decide that a kiss is the point at which you are no longer abstinent, because for you, that is when you've hit a too intimate point. Sometimes that moving target might be a helpful thing, but sometimes that might be a harmful thing. The cons of this, we've talked about a lot of them already. This doesn't address the level of risk in a lot of behaviors. Usually when we give an intimacy-based definition of abstinence, we only talk about the risk associated with intercourse, and we don't talk about other risky behaviors. And as we heard earlier, that means that teens are more likely to engage in those behaviors without fully understanding the health risk that they are presented with. And should they encounter those health risks by violence, they don't have the information that they need in order to seek medical help. And again, you know, how are we going to talk about sexual violence if this is going to be our framework? It's possible, but since this depends on the emotional effects of sex to talk about abstinence, the natural tendency is toward guilt-based reasoning. It's toward the message that teens are going to feel unhappy. They're going to feel impure. They're going to feel somehow ruined, like the way we heard Elizabeth Smart talking about how she felt. So then there's a feeling of not having any self-worth, as Elizabeth Smart said. So these are important things for us to wrestle with either of these models, but often, especially with the intimacy-based model, we need to really think about the effect on survivors. And then with either of these models, we still need to think about this virginity concept. Virginity is this idea that there is a binary. There's before sex, and then there's after sex. And that those are two distinct times that come with certain attributes. So with this concept, once your virginity is gone, it's gone forever. It often makes it so that choosing to abstain once you've had intercourse seems unnecessary to teens. It's an, oh, well, I lost my virginity, it's gone. So let's take a look at this idea of loss. Virginity is something within this cultural definition that gets taken away from girls. And my favorite example of this is the line in Taylor Swift's song 15. It really helps us to see what those peer and cultural messages that teens are getting are. And Taylor says, "And Abigail gave everything she had to a boy who changed his mind, and we both cried." And the first time I heard this, and every time I hear this, I just want to scream, everything she had, really? Is a woman's first intercourse really all that she has to offer the world? Is this how Abigail defined her self-worth? I think we can do better for Abigail and for Elizabeth Smart and for the girls in your church. I know this is a difficult question for us to ask in a culture where the concept of virginity is so strong and so prevalent, but I really want you to ask yourself, is virginity a useful concept? Is it one that you want to use in your teaching, or is it one that you want to debunk? Because if it's not making our children healthier or safer, and in fact, it's giving victims of sexual abuse a lowered sense of self-worth, as well as giving girls who do engage in intercourse a lowered sense of self-worth, who is benefiting? Why do we still use this construct? So I encourage you to wrestle with that, chew on that question for a little while. But do we need this concept of virginity? Or are there other ways that we can talk about sexuality with our teens? So while you wrestle with that question, I want to offer one other word of warning. And this is a trap that's really prevalent in faith communities. When you teach abstinence, be aware of purity culture. Purity culture developed in the last few decades as a response to the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s. And you'll see in front of you a definition of purity culture from Patheos.com. It says, what I call the purity culture encompasses the emphasis on virginity before marriage and on maintaining emotional purity that pervades fundamentalism and evangelicalism, made visible in purity bowls, purity rings, purity pledges, and modesty teachings. These teachings are not limited to fundamentalism and evangelicalism and can be seen in the culture at large, with the slut-virgin dichotomy and the prevalence of abstinence-only sex education in public schools. In its most extreme, the purity culture involves giving up dating for a return to parent-guided courtship and even arranged marriages. So maybe you bought into the purity culture. I actually did as a teen. But let's talk about the effect of purity culture on teens. And I want to start with female teens in particular, because in purity culture, female teens are the responsible party. One piece of evidence for that is that purity balls are for girls. Girls promise their dads that they will not have sex until marriage at these balls. This responsibility that falls on the girls makes it so that survivors of sexual violence feel responsible. It means that the girls are responsible for guarding their purity, and so if it leaves this sense that she must have done something to cause this. And we see this in stories of sexual assault all the time when people ask questions like, what was she wearing? This places the responsibility for a crime on the victim of the crime, and we know that that's wrong. And then within this, there's also the risk of not getting health information out there, and the message just being don't. So then let's talk about the effect on male teens. The danger here is a message that male teens aren't responsible for their own actions, and that excuses sexual violence. So one current example that we're seeing in media of purity culture, to kind of give you an image of what this can look like, is the Duggar family from the TLC show 21 Kids and Counting. And in an article in Time magazine in 2015, there's some commentary about that and its relationship to rape culture. So I wanted to share that with you. It's what I continue to find most disturbing about modesty culture, sometimes called purity culture, especially in light of the recent scandal involving the Duggars, is the link between it and rape culture. If rape culture is defined as a culture that normalizes sexual assault and finds ways to blame said assault on victims, modesty culture is certainly the twin to such disordered thinking. If it's the responsibility of the woman to keep the man in check through what she wears, then if he crosses the line, doesn't that suggest she's at fault somehow? So in purity culture, boys are not given a lot of credit often, and are seen as uncontrollable, and really sometimes are given a predator mindset. This idea that we talked about before of virginity being something that a boy can take, it creates this system in which sexual violence is not intentionally, but is really it creates a recipe for all of the things that a culture needs to encourage sexual violence. So I just want us to be really mindful of that, and very aware as we're thinking about how we're talking about sexuality in our faith communities. There is so much out there that so many curricula available that that send these messages loud and clear, even if they're not intentional. Okay, now that we have wrestled with virginity and with purity culture, let's go back to those two common definitions of abstinence, the risk-based definition and the intimacy-based. Both of these models and definitions have the capacity to harm survivors of sexual violence, and both of these definitions have the potential to include survivors in meaningful ways if we are mindful of them. They both have benefits and they both have flaws. So let's move toward a better model that takes the best of both. And step one in creating a better model is to start with survivors in mind. According to the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys will be sexually abused before they turn 18 years old. So we have to recognize the potential for a trauma response. You might say something before having these conversations like, before we begin, we acknowledge the reality that there are likely survivors in the room. And speak directly to that experience and offer resources. Say, it's okay if you need to get up and leave. An adult will come check on you. Say, it's okay if you need to tune out at any point. Say, it's okay if you need to talk after this. I will stick around and talk as long as you need. So now that we have acknowledged that survivors are there in our faith communities and amongst our teens, what do we want to teach these victim survivors that are in our faith communities and in our youth groups? So allow me to give you the high points of a lesson on abstinence that really puts survivors first. Okay, here's where we start. Some sexual behaviors have health risks, whether done by choice or by violence. It's important to know about health risks and treatments, and to know that you don't need to feel ashamed when you are seeking medical treatment. So then we'll talk about those health risks and what treatment options are and give all of that information. Then, for some periods of your life, you may choose not to engage in certain sexual activities. This is often called abstinence. And that can be a very wise personal choice. This lowers your risk of STI, pregnancy, and it may be an emotionally or spiritually healthy choice for you. And then we talk about how if you aren't abstinent now, you can decide to be abstinent in the future. Scripture says that to everything there's a season and a time to every purpose. And perhaps the purpose of your life now or later means that a season of abstaining from some sexual activities is a wise choice for you. That may be true now or in the future. And of course, we say again, sexual violence removes that choice. If you are a survivor of violence, it's not your fault. You're not impure or dirty. You are loved and you are a survivor. There's no shame, and you can always talk to me if you need a listening ear or resources. That message to teens, we just can't leave out. And then finally, we'll talk about virginity, and we'll say that it's a social construct, that we're not better or worse after intercourse, that you may have a number of feelings, but you are still you and you still have value. And that it won't make you a bad person or a bad spouse one day. Like I just said, scripture says there are seasons in our lives. That's not just 2 seasons, like virginity, the concept of virginity in our culture makes us think, before sex and after sex. There are lots of seasons. So you and the people who care about you and God can work together to determine the season that you are in. So there are the high points. We talk risk, we talk intimacy, we remove shame, we talk about choice and choice being taken away. We talk about seasons, we debunk virginity. And now that you've heard that all of that is possible, you are maybe ready for a totally new way to think about abstinence. You heard me say in the high points that there may be times when you choose not to engage in some sexual activities, and many people call that abstinence. Well, my next step would be to invite them to actually set that term aside for a moment and flip the whole script on abstinence. So instead of asking, at what point am I no longer abstinent, or at what point am I no longer a virgin, I would invite them to ask these 2 questions. Is this sexual activity no risk, low risk, or high risk? And the second question, is this sexual activity low intimacy, medium intimacy, or high intimacy? So let's start with the first question, which is about risk. Risk is determined scientifically. It's not subject to opinion. This is about health and physical safety. So these categories don't change. We can put these sexual activities into this chart for our teens. They can see what's no risk, what's low risk, what's high risk. And we can let them know that high risk activities, that if they engage in high risk activities, barriers can lower the risk of STI, and pregnancy and birth control can lower the risk of unintended pregnancy. So this is set, but then let's go to our next question. Our next question was, is this activity low intimacy, medium intimacy, or high intimacy? Now, we can't fill this chart out for our teens because this changes person to person. So in this way, we can really personalize our curriculum and really get our kids involved in thinking about what it would mean for them to abstain in a healthy way. For one person, cuddling might go in high intimacy. For another, it might go in low intimacy. And this chart may change. Things may move on this chart in different seasons of your life, and that's okay too. So now that we've talked about the traditional ways to talk about abstinence, and we've looked at this chart method, with the chart method, if I know that I am not ready for a health risk, but I am ready for a certain level of intimacy, I can figure out what activities would fall into both of those categories. And you can remind your students that with God's help, with the people who love them, with their own prayer and discernment, they can determine whether this season of their life is to be a no-risk season. If it's to be a low intimacy season, you're giving them the tools to figure that out. So remember, at the very beginning of this conversation, we said that when we talked about abstinence, our real goal was health and safety. That's what we want for our youth when we're teaching abstinence. And we saw that with some of our traditional methods of teaching abstinence, we've actually been doing the opposite. We also learned that with some of these traditional ways, we were giving an incomplete story. And we also saw that we were doing harm to victim survivors of sexual violence. We really wanted the best of both definitions. And with this chart method, hopefully we can get everything that we want and accomplish the goal that we set out at the beginning, health and safety. Now, you heard me mention sexual violence when we talked about the health risk chart, but we really need to finish that conversation with our teens. So where does sexual violence fit in the chart? First, the risk chart. Acts of sexual violence may be low risk, medium risk, or high risk to your physical health. This is not the same as being low risk, medium, or high risk to your overall sense of well-being or your emotional or spiritual health. And so it's important to seek help for your physical, emotional, and spiritual effects that that sexual violence may have on your life. And second, the intimacy chart. Where does sexual violence fit on the intimacy chart? It doesn't. Acts of sexual violence do not fit in our intimacy chart because they are not about care and intimacy. They are about power and control. Sexual violence is about using sexual acts to gain power and control. So we have to make that completely clear. I hope that you have found some food for thought, some tools here to help you put survivors first in your teaching. And I want to invite you to think about some questions that will help you figure out what you're going to do with this information and these tools. You are welcome to go ahead and ask these questions if you want to, or to answer the questions to ask your questions or to answer the questions I'm going to give you right here on YouTube. And we can continue our conversation if you'd like, or you can just take these with you and chew on them. But here are my questions for you. What pushback might you receive if you tried to change the way you talk about abstinence and virginity in your setting? What pushback might you receive? And then, does your community understand the connection between sexuality education and sexual violence? And if not, what information do they need to be able to make that connection? And what resources do you need in order to have that conversation with them? And then my final question for you is, where else might your ministry lack a trauma-informed and survivor-aware message? Where else do you need to put victim survivors of sexual violence first in your ministry? So I encourage you to chew on those questions, take a look at the resources, and thank you for being a part of this really important conversation, and for continuing to work to make your students the healthiest and the safest that they can be. Blessings on your ministry.
Thanks, Lydia. That was really informative. So this conversation grew out of the training that we did in Austin, which was the Healthy Teen Relationship training that you did. And these were two issues that people were really struggling with. I'm going to just tell you a little story. I worked at King County Sexual Assault Resource Center for a while, and the first time that I ever realized how significant these issues were for teens was when I learned about a young woman who was from a very conservative religious family, very devout, and she was sexually assaulted. And the biggest roadblock for her healing and for her self-acceptance after the assault was, one, she was ashamed well, she was afraid everyone would be, think she was dirty. And she was terrified that her father wouldn't love her anymore because she was no longer the pure little girl that, he knew and loved. And so her mother told me this story that he, and this is not a man who liked to have conversations about sexuality or really anything. He went out and he bought her a little pearl necklace, and this is not a wealthy family. And he basically said, "You are as pure to me as the day you were born. And the gift that you have to give, only you can give. It can't be taken." And it was just made such a huge difference in her life. So I think, those stories of how our messages impact people is just, it's powerful. And I know you were talking about the impact on LGBTQ kids who were feeling isolated from the conversation, or like they weren't being represented or seen for who they were. So I wonder if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah, so there are so many ways that people express their sexuality, and not all of those ways involve intercourse, which when we do traditional conversations about abstinence, that tends to be the only sexual activity that we talk about. And like we talked about before, when we failed to talk about any of the others, some of them come with health risks, and we don't talk about those. And also, we don't talk about the fact that you may be in a healthy sexual relationship for, over a long period of time, that by these definitions would make you abstinent. But you have a healthy sexual relationship, because sexuality isn't just this one act that our culture kind of makes it out to be. Our sexuality is far more broad and far more nuanced, and making room for other ways of expressing sexuality for teens gives them more safe and healthy options.
Yeah, absolutely. And just the focus on combining the health issues with intimacy, and how important it is to center intimacy as a core component of healthy relationships, instead of the kind of Beavis and Butthead message that so many of them get.
Yes. Yeah. And I think no matter what, whether you kind of deconstruct the whole thing like I did today, or you say, my community is never going to get on board with that, and I've got to do something a lot closer to one of these traditional teachings, that there's room within both of them. Even if you don't have the room to deconstruct the whole thing, you have the room to put in the resources that your kids need to stay safe.
Yeah. And that is what we want. We want them to be safe and happy.
Yes.
So I want to thank you, Reverend Lydia Mulkey, for having this conversation with us. And I want to thank the In Faith Community Foundation for helping sponsor this conversation. And we wish you all well, and please stay tuned for what comes next. So thank you. Bye-bye.